Again, the international border is on the cliff's edge. But between 1948 and 1967, there has been encroachments. The Syrians slowly moved down. You know how you have an encroachment when you have a base, and now you want to build a toilet. So you put a toilet just a little bit outside the base, but now you have to put a guard tower to guard the toilet. So you put that a little bit then, and then you bring somebody to guard the guard tower, and now there are two people, so they need some water, so you have to build a road. Anyway, the Syrians made their way down to the water's edge. By June 4, 1967, right, the war breaks out June 5th. June 4, 1957, the Syrians are sitting on the water over here. And this is the exact spot that they require or demand to return to. Not the international border, but the June 4 border where they are sitting on the water's edge. So you'll hear many different borders. You hear people talking about the 48 border, the 49 border, which is armistice lines, this June 4 border, the 67 border, the international border. They're all different lines, moving a meter here, a meter there. But as you can see here, when you move the line just 1 meter to the left or 10 meters on a map, it brings you from the cliff down to the water's edge. So yes, it matters. And the size here is crucial for understanding the reality of the border. As far as this border is concerned, with Lebanon, we've had a pretty good relationship until the mid-70s. There was no fence here. The only thing demarking the border were a series of barrels, and sometimes farmers would cross over, and sometimes herds would cross over and grazing. There was no actual physical border, but this was a line. It was a relative peaceful border. Again, Israel has no demands in Lebanon, and the Lebanese at the time, we're talking about a conglomeration of many different ethnic groups, were predominantly Christian and Sunni Muslims and Druze, and a few other small ones, but the Shiites were still very, very small. In the early 70s, King Hussein, I talked about this yesterday, King Hussein kicks out the Palestinians from Jordan, sends Arafat and his people into Lebanon. The Fatah land moves from there to here. We're starting to have in the early 70s infiltrations from Lebanon into Israel and acts of terror. In this kibbutz here, one of the most well-known events of a terror unit that made their way into the border, into the children's home. Remember the kibbutzim kids grew up separately, into the children's home, killing several children and their nanny. Okay, so this, and there's several of such stories along the border. So this becomes a very difficult place to live. The Palestinian groups in Lebanon are starting to use Lebanon as a base against Israel. At the same time, the War of 1973, the October War. Okay, again, a war on two fronts, in Egypt and in Syria. The Syrians make it almost to the border. We're able to push them back. There's an armistice sign with Kissinger, setting up a UN force called UNDOF, United Nations Disengagement and Observation Force. The Israelis wanted a disengagement force, the Syrians wanted an observation force. So Kissinger compromised by making it a disengagement and observation force. But because we had an armistice agreement with Syria, and I told you that's a very peaceful border, now they use Lebanon as the base to attack Israel. So we have a growing Palestinian resistance movements, terror movements. We're talking about Fatah and Abu Jihad and Abu Nidal and Ahmed Jibril and many different, and the Popular Front and the Liberation Front and all sorts of organizations from Lebanon who are fighting Israel, including the civil war that goes on in Lebanon. The 70s is wild in Lebanon. There's a big civil war going on, everybody against everybody, but everybody's united against Israel. And a rise in the Shiite movements in Lebanon, because the Shiites now are starting to be a larger group in the population, and they're not represented in the Lebanese political system. The Lebanese had a very a system that that requires a national balance, national pact. The president is always Christian, the prime minister is always Sunni Muslim, the Speaker of the House is Shiite, and the Minister of Defense or the head of the army is Druze. Never mind that, I'll get into those details. So this becomes actually a very, very hot border. It all comes to a head in the early 80s, 1982. Ambassador Argov in London there's attempted assassination of his life. He died later on, many years later, but attempted assassination on his life. And the response in an Israeli attack into Lebanon, the first Lebanese war, trying to wipe out all the Palestinian terror groups from Lebanon. Initially, it was supposed to be a limited operation just for the south, 40 kilometers, and Ariel Sharon called back after 24 hours saying, oops, I arrived in Beirut. The result of that war is that we did get to kick out Arafat and his people from Beirut, sent them to Tunis, but Israel also got bogged down for the next 20 years inside Lebanon. We created a security zone, a buffer zone, that Israeli army was inside this territory. We established a local militia that were our aides and our allies inside Lebanon, and it remained that way for 20 years. During that time, we opened the Good Fence. Okay, the Good Fence is a border crossing in Metula, which is down there. During those years, those were considered very good years, because for those 20 years, thousands of Lebanese would cross the border every day, work in Israel. Lebanese children would come for summer camps and enjoy the Canada Center and the ice skating rink and the swimming pool, all the facilities over there. And that was considered, that's why it's called the Good Fence. You see that Lebanese and Israelis can actually go across the border and work with each other. Everything was fine, except that Israeli army was inside here. And it was a war of attrition. Every few months there would be an incident, Israeli soldiers would get killed, and the pressure was mounting inside Israel to do something about it. It all came to a head at the end of the 90s, okay, after there were several series of events with many Israeli casualties, including a helicopter accident where 2 helicopters crashed mid-air and over 70 Israeli soldiers were killed at once. And then in May 2000, Prime Minister at the time, Ehud Barak, says, okay, experiment is over, enough is enough, we're out. And he quickly removed all Israeli forces from southern Lebanon and moved them back into Israel. Redeployment along the border, set the border with Kofi Annan, at the time the Secretary General of the United Nations, and they went back to the maps and they drew the line on exactly by the centimeter on the internationally recognized line between Israel and Lebanon, including in the valley below, right there. You see there's a village in the valley, it's a standalone village. That village is called Raja. It's an Alawite village that used to be Syrian. After 1967, it became Israeli. Israel said, we don't, we'll put the border to the south of you. Said, no, we want to be part of Israel. And the Lebanese didn't want to take them because they were Syrian, so they became part of Israel. The village expanded and a little bit to the north, when they came to draw the line, Kofi Annan insisted that the line go straight through the village. So today that village straddles the border. They're still Israeli, but Hezbollah is in the northern part of the village. So it's not very simple, and I can tell you already that a lot of people there, people who work in the kibbutz where we're staying, some of them live there, and they told me that they were making plans to move into Israel when that becomes again part of Lebanon. But that's all. That brings us to where we are today, the border with Lebanon. The events that led up to the 2006 war are well known and documented, and I don't need to go into the details right now. Suffice it to say that because Hamas in the south, kidnapping of Gilad Shalit, and 2 weeks later an attack of Hezbollah in the north and the kidnapping of 2 other Israeli soldiers, including a barrage of thousands of rockets on Israeli towns and villages, forced Israel's government's hand into an invasion of Lebanon again, and the Second Lebanon War began. It was a 32-day war. We went